favorites. I am so excited to come back to you with another episode in this new year of 2023 when this will be airing. And we're going to talk about a very specific genre today, and it's a very different one from the last episode's genre, which was script writing. Today we're going to talk about historical novels, and we'll talk about some specific things in it. But let's first welcome our lovely guest and learn a little bit about her. So Gina is here with us, and her latest novel is her first solo, which is amazing. It just released last week, from the date that we're recording this. It's called The Virgins of Venice, and it is by HarperCollins. She has co-authored three historical novels, however. The Sidewalk Artist is a dual-time story about the Renaissance master Raphael. Ciao Bella, which takes place in northern Italy in the summertime after World War II. And The Wolves of St. Peter's, which is a murder mystery set at the time Michelangelo was painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling in Rome. So that was a lot of amazing history to unpack, and I love it. I love that you're, intertwining it with different genres, and I think that's something that we can all be inspired by. So thank you for taking the time to come and share your wisdom with us today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I'm going to let you introduce yourself. I mean, I did read a pretty impressive portfolio there, but if you have anything you want to introduce yourself to the audience a little bit, and then we'll get into our questions.
Sure. So I'm Gina Buonaguro. I'm originally from New Jersey, and I married a Canadian man and live in Toronto now, in Canada. Um, and I've always loved reading and writing ever since I was young. And when I moved to Canada about 20 years ago, couldn't work initially and legally. And so while I waited for the visa, I decided to write that novel that I always wanted to write. And so I ended up co-authoring that novel. That became my first novel, The Sidewalk Artist. I had met a woman in a class and we started our own little writing group. And then she kind of built on my idea so much that I asked her if she wanted to co-write it. And she said yes. And so we ended up writing 6 books together, 3 historical and 3 contemporary romances under a pen name. So a few years ago, we decided to amicably part ways. And that's when I decided I wanted to continue in the historical fiction genre, which I just love to read. And I love the research. And so that's what the Virgins of Venice became.
Wow, and I'd like to point out too that these pen name, the 3 romance novels, you self-published first, and they were so successful that they were picked up by a traditional publisher, which is, quite the glory story. Doesn't happen all the time. And I think it's worth mentioning to listeners because you've had both sides of that coin. You've
Yeah.
experienced both sides of that, and I think that does bring a lot of extra experience. So yeah, we are so happy to have you here. And the first question that I kind of want to kick into is, um, basically, I mean, you mentioned that you've done a solo and you've obviously written 6 books with someone else. Is it easier or harder to write collaboratively? And are there just pros and cons of both? What has your experience been there?
So my co-author Janice Kirk and I wrote together for 15 years. And I would say at first, I mean, it was great because when you first start out, when you're writing your first novel, you're learning along the way. And so there I had someone to talk about it with all the time.
Mm,
She was a fellow writer, a fellow editor, a fellow sounding board. We would talk about ideas and techniques. And so I feel like, I did essentially an MFA with her together. We both learned
yeah.
so much about writing and got better over time. Part of the reason we ended up splitting is our interests kind of diverged. She was really interested in murder mysteries, and I realized I was less interested in that. And so
Mm,
I wanted to do just more pure historical fiction, maybe what you'd call women's historical fiction.
mm,
So it depends when at the beginning it worked so well, and towards the end it got harder as I think we got more confident in each of our own abilities.
mm.
um I have zero regrets. It was a fabulous experience. She's still my friend, and I really feel like I learned an incredible amount from working with her. And so that said, now I feel very confident in what I want to write and how I write and my own voice. That was one thing, is everyone says, how do you have a single voice when you have two authors, a unified voice? And so it did take a lot of work, probably extra time, because we go back and forth and back and forth, and to the end of the process where we'd be proofreading it, and we would read it aloud and literally discuss every word to make sure it felt right to both of us. So it was a very
Mm.
time consuming process, but
Yeah.
very helpful, because again, I learned a whole lot from the process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that you gleaned the good from having somebody to work with on your first manuscript, being in a position where I'm closer to that than I am to having published 7 books. Sometimes you wish you had someone to talk to about this and someone to tell you, oh, hey, this is not crazy. This is actually flowing. This is working good, right? And that's what you kind of aim for when you eventually get an agent or an editor. But I love that you kind of use that as a tool, and that now you're just moving on to a new phase of life. And I think that with writing, we think too often that once you've published it, you've arrived, and you have so much more to learn. There's so much more to learn about writing,
Oh
and I
yeah.
think you can always connect more with human beings through it. So that's perfect. That's a great
Yeah.
example. And part of what you love with the historical insight, um, I mean, there's a lot of research that has to happen. I'm not as familiar with it personally because I don't dabble in historical fiction, but I have a great appreciation for it. And so I wanted to ask, is it does it take a while for you? Does it just depend on what you're researching to feel like you're ready to make these narratives when you're researching, history inspires you?
Yeah, interesting. Our first book was a dual timeline novel, so we kind of had the best of both worlds. But and it was about the artist Raphael, so we could kind of focus more singularly on him.
Mm,
And then we did our World War II novel, which many people do. And there's so much written about that, and you know a fair amount, but you don't necessarily know all the details.
yeah.
And then going back to the Renaissance, I feel like with the third book, The Wolves of St. Peter's, and then the book I've written now, because World of St. Peter's was set in Rome around the same time, Renaissance Rome, and then Venice. We did a lot more research for the Rome book, and then for the Venice book, we had actually started writing the book set in Venice together. I just I did so much research to the point where you absorb you need to absorb it so that you can write it. If that makes sense? So you have to read. I found a lot of times I'm not reading primary sources. I'm not going to the archives and reading, trying to puzzle out Renaissance Venetian language, but I am relying on the works of academics that have written books and articles to really absorb the culture, the government structure, what the lives of women were like. And you can also read, after a while, after you've really delved into a topic or an era, you almost can deduce things by what's not being said or what's being left out. For example, when Venice is known for making many laws, and they'd make stricter laws as time goes by, and you realize that's because nobody was following the original law. So that you can take that time period and be, oh well, that's where they were flouting flouting that law and doing more that they felt they needed to later crack down on. So that's the
Mm,
kind of thing where you need to just be able to absorb it. And you need to the other that I found really hard is like, they sat down to dinner, did they use a fork? And you have to like find out when forks started being used.
wow. Yes.
So there's a lot of precision research what did they eat? What was in season? No
Yeah.
tomatoes yet in Italy in 1509 because Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. You didn't really get all those things that we think of almost as like typical Italian cuisine
Yeah.
till decades later.
Oh my
So you
gosh.
have, and the thing is, you might be like, wow, do you really need to know that? But you get these readers out there who really know their history, and they will
They,
call you.
they check your facts.
Exactly. So I'm paranoid that I'm going to get something majorly wrong all the time. So the problem is balancing the copious amounts of research with actually writing. It's always
Yeah.
easy to do more research, right? All right, I'll
Yes.
read another book, I'll read another article, but then you of course have to write and integrate it. And so the more you can kind of absorb it and make it more natural in your head, then the easier it is to do the writing. So you have to have that balance. But you
Mm,
need to spend a fair amount of time delving into the era, I think, before you can even put pen to paper or fingers to the typewriter. No one uses a typewriter anymore.
They should, because they're cool.
But
It's
you know
funny.
what I mean.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's funny that you mentioned that because my next question really was, I think some people imagine with historical, I guess any kind of historical writing, even if it's fiction, is that, you're trekking to the monk archives somewhere and you're dusting off the scrolls and trying to figure out what it is. And I mean, it's a great image. It brings to mind Indiana Jones, but that's not really kind of how this works now. And
No.
so I guess I would ask, how do you know where to look and where would you suggest listeners who kind of love that genre should start looking for their inspiration? Does your inspiration come from, did you happen across some fact that you're like, oh, I should write a book about this? Or is it more, in retrospect that you're looking at the facts?
Well, probably you're not going to write historical fiction unless you love to read historical fiction, is my guess. So you probably already have a time period in mind. So you're going to read novels based on that. And almost always nowadays, authors at the back, historical fiction authors at the back of the book put their sources. And they'll say, I use this book and that book. And so that's a great starting point. If you're like, I want to write about World War II, take a World War II novel that you love set in, let's call it, I read a book recently set in the Philippines in World War II, which I'd never read that kind of, I've always read France and Germany and England and Italy, but never Philippines. And so I was like, wow. So let's say I wanted to write about that myself. I'd go to the back of that book. I'd see what the sources the author used. I'd start by reading those. Then you kind of, are led down the path of finding, you find out what your specific interest is, like what's your hook, what's your story, and a lot of times it is the stories that are kind of almost mentioned in passing, or that can make the most interesting storyline. For example, for the book The Virgins of Venice, what struck me and what I ended up writing about was that if you were a patrician noble woman in your teens, your father would decide whether you got married or went into a convent. Those were your only two paths in life that you had no decision-making power over. And and so the convents were filled with women with no calling. Nowadays, if you're a nun, you have a calling, right?
Right.
But those days, they were kind of like sorority houses. They were filled with women, and it would be your aunts and your cousins, and then other families, and that would be, cattiness and parties, and there would be, you read about them, and there's like chickens running around, and people had cats and dogs and pets and things. And so you realize, I'm like, that's fascinating, right? Like, what is going on inside these convents? Because you just think they're sitting there praying and they're holy.
Right.
But they're not necessarily. Very few women had callings. So, but many women were in these convents. So I thought, well, that's a really interesting.
That is fascinating. Yeah.
So in fact, in my book, it's about a set of sisters, and they each have that path. One of them has to get married, and one of them has to join a convent. And what is this like? And we're talking 14, 15, 16-year-old girls.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
And do you find the satisfaction coming from kind of giving voice to these stories that kind of feel like they deserve to have a voice that no one knows about? I mean, is that part of what drives you?
Very much so, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think finding these stories of women who didn't have voices and is to me really interesting. Yeah, that's actually, I at one point I was reading something recently, and the advice was create a tagline for what your fiction is. And I was like, that's a good idea. So my tagline on my website says reviving women's stories lost to history.
Oh, very
And
good.
it's interesting. Several people have commented on that now that they've come to my website. So it's like, for me, it just sharpened what I want to do. That's what I want to do.
Yeah, and that's kind of I mentioned that because it's the magic of what we do, right? This is why we choose to write, that fulfillment that comes from you giving voice to something that maybe nobody else will. And I find that, absolutely important. So, let's kind of change directions here a little bit. How was it publishing your first solo? Was there something that you didn't expect from it? Was it all just kind of in the hands of the publisher? How was your experience with that when you switched over to your own book?
Yeah, I mean, publishing a solo novel with a publisher is not really any different than publishing it with co-author. So that there was really very few surprises there. The whole process is very similar where, the editor purchases your book and then gives some general comments. So then you can revise based on that. And then they send it out to a copy editor, and then you respond to that, and then they send it out to a proofreader and they respond to that. So that's all the same with the cover, which is they present cover options to you. Authors have very little say on their covers. If you hate it, you can tell them, but otherwise so anyway, I was very happy with my cover, so I have no complaints. I'm not a very visual person. I'm a very verbal person. So it's a cover. I saw it. I was like, I'd pick that book up. That's kind of how I went with it. So
Yeah.
you can't judge a book by its cover.
We all do it. We all do it.
We do it. You have to have an inviting, appealing cover. So yeah, I wouldn't say that was that was a drastically different experience.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's good to know. I mean, for those considering, should I collaborate? Should I just keep it close to my own chest and maybe think about just what would work best for the book
Yeah.
and move forward from there. And
The big difference would be self-publishing. And people make that conscious decision. Sometimes it happens because you can't get a traditional publisher, but there are authors out there, they say, I want to have control over everything. And so I will do it all myself. It's a huge proposition because it's almost like you need to think of yourself as I try to think of myself as a business in a way anyway. But like you have to be doing the cover design, all the marketing, all the publicity yourself.
Yeah. You are the publisher, the editor, the agent, the writer.
Yeah,
yes.
Exactly.
And it's a lot. It's a lot. And
It's
good that you mentioned too. I mean, you think that I just can't get this publisher, I'm gonna throw it out there. That's not how that works. And in fact, I've been surprised with this show how many authors who were traditionally published switch over to being independently published because that control is more important to them and they think they can do it, and so it's definitely something worth considering, but just note that it is a lot of extra work,
It is a lot of extra work.
marketing is its
You're not
own
focusing only on the writing at that point, really.
Yes.
I think the other thing that I didn't find surprising, but I think your readers might appreciate that if you do get traditionally published where you get marketing and publicity help and support, which I will tell you is very much commensurate with the size of your advance. The smaller your advance, the less they give you. The bigger your advance, the more they give you in terms of that. But that I still wanted to do some of my own marketing and publicity. For example, here I am talking to you. Did my publicist arrange this conversation with you? Nope. That was all my own networking, because I feel like I can't just rely solely on them, as though they're very supportive. I'm not unhappy, but I think there's always more that can be done. And I learned that from previous traditionally published books. Like I remember the very first meeting with my publicist for the Sidewalk Artist. I met the publicist. We had a tiny advance for that one, and I said I have all these ideas and this, and literally she didn't even take out a piece of pen or like a pen and a notebook to like take a single note. She just sat there. She wasn't going to do anything that I said. And it was really clear. Whereas now I'm talking to my publicist and she's much more responsive and helpful and has ideas and is communicative. So it really can vary.
Wow. Yes. I don't think that's something that we've talked about on the show yet. So I appreciate you bringing that up too. It varies from author to author. It varies from publishing house to publishing house too. And there's pros and cons there with your advances, but you should always be doing things to promote yourself. And that doesn't mean that you need to get on Twitter and be crazy every day and trying to figure out how to get every post optimized. But I think it is important, especially where this is a job that you can do from your basement, right? That we're both in our basement right now. That you make yourself known to other people and just get yourself out there a little bit. And it's admirable that you continue to do that, even though you have a publisher that can help you with that. So, it's time for the hardest question, which is our secret sauce question. Prepped her for it though. And we've changed the wording a little bit because I'd love to know what you think from your experience, both as a writer, working with another writer, and being around publishers and authors. What makes a piece of art great?
Yeah, that is the really crux of it, right? So, I mean, for me, for my books and this book that I wrote, this latest book, The Virgins of Venice, for me, what made it great was that I wrote something that I would want to read. Um, and I didn't worry about genre exactly or using like it's quite maybe academic. It's not, no, it's not academic, but like my character is a writer, and I'm talking about Venetian publishing houses from 1509, and things like that maybe are esoteric is probably a better word. But I was like, you know what? This is the kind of book I love learning these things myself when I read other people's historical fiction. And so I wanted to bring it to life in Venice in that time period. And so I did a ton of research and then I wrote what I wanted to write. And so to me, it was the best book I could write. So I guess that makes it, in my opinion, a great piece, a great piece of my art. I'm hoping that, I have a sequel in mind, and I'm hoping I can make that better and greater, but we'll see.
Always the hope. Always the hope.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's important. Like, don't feel like you have to write, so no, you shouldn't cast aside, what people want to read. But there is a thriving for historical fiction. There's a thriving historical fiction readership out there, and I feel like it's growing. I see it mentioned more and more as a category in
Mm,
best books of the year and things like that, that I don't feel like it was 5 years ago. And so I think if you can bring a story to life that's not known in a beautiful way, that to me is great art.
wow. That was a mic drop if I ever heard one. I hope readers are listening, and I hope that resonates with them, because that is beautiful and very true. Uh, and just for those of you listening, it'll be after Christmas, but it's not too late to give yourself a holiday gift with this book, because it is recently, I mean, it is fresh off the press right now, and it is beautiful. And like we said, the cover is great, and you'll just enjoy it. And if you haven't given historical fiction a chance, now is the time to do that, because there's, I mean, it almost feels like that's too broad of a genre. There are so many categories
Yeah.
within it,
Oh, yeah.
and eras, and I mean, it's just,
Yeah.
there's something for everybody. It really
Absolutely.
is. Yeah.
There
So
absolutely
it's
is.
a great place to start. And we also want to know, what are you, Gina, reading, or what would you suggest that we need to know about reading right now?
I want, if you don't mind me making one little plug for myself, which is
Please do.
I do book clubs. This is a great book club book. So if people
Wow.
are interested, you can go to my website and or email me, and we'll connect. So in terms of what I'm reading, I'm of course reading historical fiction. I'm actually reading a Philippa Gregory book right now, which is, she does the Tudor history. So I'm doing that. I really want to get my hands on the new book called The Marriage Portrait. It's by the
Mm.
same author, and forgive me, I can't remember her name, but she also wrote the book Hamnet, which came out a few years ago. And Hamnet was about the son of Shakespeare. And she wrote a new book. It just came out called The Marriage Portrait. She's a beautiful, beautiful writer. So she's writing historical fiction in a beautiful, literary, but accessible way. So
Oh, and
that's
that
my
Shakespeare Incorporation, she's already got me interested. So
next.
it's very exciting. I'll have to definitely put that on my Goodreads and get a hold of it.
Yes, it's a great book.
Awesome. And uh, besides, this wonderful book that you just released, and some of the ones that we know about, we'd love to anticipate, your upcoming one, like you said, your sequel that you're thinking about. And it's awesome that you do book clubs, because I don't think everybody does that. But as you can tell, she's a lovely conversationalist, so definitely look her up. How else can we be a part of your community and support you?
Oh,
Where
thank
can we
you.
find
Yeah.
you?
So my website is Ginabu, GINABU.com. I tried to keep it really simple because I have a very complicated last name. I'm on Facebook. Um, and I'm on Goodreads, and I'm on BookBub. I've made a conscious decision not to do Twitter or TikTok.
Mm.
TikTok, because I don't really understand it, though I know there's a lot of book talkers out there. But I feel like I could be spending a lot of time book talking and not enough time writing. And same with Twitter, which is a rabbit hole we all know about. So anyway,
Yes.
I'm on Facebook, GinaBu.com, BookBub, and Goodreads, and I would love to do book clubs and love to connect with people.
Wonderful. As we're wrapping up here, is there any last piece of advice that you would give to the newer writers who are looking to start their, query publishing journey?
I think that might be actually at the moment be my number one advice. Don't get social media is important, but if you get too bogged down with it, you're not actually writing and reading, which is if you're a writer, that's your main job. I would say you need to spend most of your time writing and reading and not Twittering and Facebooking and TikToking. It's tempting, it's easy, it's
Oh
a
man.
quick hit, and you feel like you've accomplished something, but it's a lot of procrastination, I find. So I
Mm.
think if people can set aside the phone and just sit and write and read. Got to read a ton. And then I think you'll and you set yourself a goal, a page a day, whatever it is, and then you'll by the end of a year you'll have a book.
Yeah. Yeah. That's perfect. And especially where we kind of mentioned it is important to market yourself, but it is deeply easy to procrastinate,
So
especially when
easy.
you're alone with your computer and other devices. So
Exactly. I've
take
been
her
there.
advice into account. Put it on your wall if you gotta. So much for coming on, Gina. You have been absolutely a pleasure to speak with, and we hope to see more of you in the future. Maybe have you come back on later and talk to us about your progress. But we appreciate you making time for us this busy holiday season.
Thanks so much, Sheridan. I really enjoyed it.
Yes, of course. And you stick around here for a minute, but for all of our listeners and word wizards and writers out there, right?